Lecture 9, Colonia Cecilia. A passenger manifest from the port of Genoa, dated the 10th of March, 1891, lists a destination that sounds like a parish and behaves like a rumor. On the steamship Europa's March sailing, 13 families and 7 single men headed for Parana. One line reads, Gatai, Francesco, with blacksmith, in the occupation column, and his wife Argia and 3 children folded into the same entry. The destination is written as if it were already a municipality, Colonia Cecilia. No ideology is required to understand the document. A clerk just needs names, a ship, a date, and a place to send bodies. It is an anarchist experiment reduced to a line item, which is exactly how most states prefer to meet utopia. The word, Cecilia, gets onto a manifest because Giovanni Rossi spent years turning a political desire into something you could mail. Rossi was born in Pisa in 1856, trained as an agronomist and veterinarian, and wrote about social life with the confidence of someone used to diagnosing livestock. Change the environment and the behavior changes. At 18 he fantasized about founding a commune overseas, first as Polynesia, later as a real itinerary, and after arrests and repression in Italy he started treating exile not as defeat but as laboratory access. In 1886 he helped publish a journal called Lo Sperimentale, with support from figures like Andrea Costa, and the title wasn't metaphor, he meant the experiment. When the passenger list calls Francesco Gatai a blacksmith, it's because Rossi's recruitment needed trades, not just slogans, and he wrote invitations like procurement orders with a moral theory attached. Rossi's obsession is immediate freedom, not a promised paradise after some future upheaval, and that urgency is what turns him into a founder even while he argues against founders. To get an authority-free society, he has to do the authority-adjacent work of coordination, write circular letters, collect names, manage departures, and convince people that leaving home is not madness but method. His archive begins before the colony does, because he publishes the idea in print, then publishes the journey, then publishes the defense, and each publication quietly appoints him the person responsible for explaining what happened. Later, when he writes a report titled Cecilia, Comunita Anarchica Sperimentale, the project is already shaped by the fact that he kept turning lived life into documents while it was still unfolding. Even before anyone reaches Parana, the experiment has a center of gravity, and it is made of paper. The most useful thing Rossi ever did for recruitment was borrow a halo from someone famous. In 1889, Carlos Gomes, Brazil's celebrated composer, becomes the intermediary in Rossi's approach to Emperor Pedro II, and the surviving correspondence frames the request in state-friendly terms: land in the south for Italian immigrants to form a colony. For Rossi, the contact is a paradox he's willing to live with. An anti-authoritarian movement is asking an emperor to authorize its escape from authority. For Pedro II, it reads like a civilizing project: populate territory, import labor, turn frontier into farms, and do it with Europeans whose names fit neatly into ledgers. An anarchist colony starts by relying on imperial stationery, and the consequence is serious. The emperor's attention makes the dream socially legible enough that families will board ships for it. Brazil rewrites itself faster than old promises can be enforced. Slavery is abolished in 1888, and on the 15th of November, 1889 the Republic is proclaimed, pushing Pedro II into exile and scrambling the legal value of anything offered under the empire. Stories later claim the emperor gave Rossi land. The paper trail is less romantic hookup, because the new regime has little incentive to honor imperial generosity, especially toward foreign anarchists. The Republic still wants immigrants. Roughly 1.2 million Italians enter Brazil between 1880 and 1900, but it wants them through colonization offices that can sell, register, and audit land in a way that produces receipts. A regime change doesn't cancel the need for settlement, it just changes the form you have to fill out to do it. Parana is already practicing this kind of population engineering long before Rossi's group arrives, and Cecilia is dropped into a landscape of earlier experiments with different slogans. From the 1870s onward, the province receives European colonies, Polish Catholic communities like Colonia Santa Barbara, German-speaking settlements like Whitmarsum, each tied to land distribution and the state's desire to make the interior look governed. After abolition, the logic tightens. European immigration is expected to supply labor and to settle territory in ways that can be mapped, taxed, and defended as modern. That is why imperial talk of land for immigrants survives the fall of the empire as a republican practice of contracts and inspections rather than a royal gift. By the time a manifest in Genoa lists Colonia Cecilia as a destination, Parana already has a bureaucratic slot ready to receive it. The timing is also punishing in a very 19th century way. Finance collapses right on schedule. In 1891, Brazil is hit by the ensilhamento crisis, a boom and crash that shreds credit and destabilizes prices while immigrants are trying to buy seeds, tools, and food in towns that already price remote as a surcharge. Cecilia can declare itself moneyless inside the communal hut, but the outside world still sells iron and flour in race, and a crash doesn't ask whether you're building socialism or just trying to plant maize. Surviving documentation from Cecilia includes proof that the colony was forced to speak this language, a financial ledger kept by Achille Dondelli, who becomes treasurer because someone has to count what is supposedly not supposed to matter. A system built to abolish money still has to count money first, because the first gatekeeper is not the priest or the police but the shopkeeper. Dondelli's ledger is the kind of artifact that makes an anti-bureaucratic movement accidentally bureaucratic. One early balance is recorded in the Brazilian notation of the time, 5:000,000 race. Money raised from supporters in Italy and carried across the Atlantic as startup capital for a moneyless society. That figure sits beside purchases of tools, seeds, and groceries, translating ideals into flour sacks and metal, because planting requires things you can't make with rhetoric. The ledger doesn't tell you whether anyone was spiritually free, but it does show the colony was financially finite, and in a place where the state demands installments and taxes, finitude is enforcement. If a utopia wants to avoid hierarchy, the first hierarchy it meets is arithmetic. Long before the crash, Rossi and the first pioneers are already moving under the pressure of timelines and ship schedules. They depart Genoa on the 20th of February, 1890, expecting to settle in Uruguay or Rio Grande do Sul, and the plan changes when seasickness forces an early landing at Paranagua on Brazil's coast. From there the group makes its way inland to Parana and the municipality of Palmeira, where colonization officials are selling parcels in districts that have been receiving Europeans for decades. The founding party is small enough to fit in a paragraph: Rossi, Arrigini, Benedetti, Zanetti, Achille Dondelli, and Dondelli's wife Catina, 5 men and 1 woman, with Rossi the oldest at 34. If the origin story feels less like a revolution and more like a travel mishap, that's because utopias, like everyone else, have to go wherever the boat lets them off. Even the cast list gets rewritten, which is how you can tell how much the story will depend on paper. Later retellings sometimes insert the anarchist Luigi, Gigi, Domioni into the founding scene, as if every movement requires a familiar name on the poster. Archival work on passenger records and early documentation does not support him as a founder, which is a small correction with a big implication. Cecilia will accumulate legends the way it accumulates colonists. Rossi's habit of publishing letters, reports, explanations, creates a gravity well that pulls memory toward whoever writes the most, not necessarily whoever did the most. Francesco Gattai's manifest line survives because bureaucrats filed it, not because anyone thought a blacksmith would be important to posterity. The name, Cecilia, comes from Rossi's fiction before it becomes a place you can describe to a shipping clerk. In a utopian novel, Cecilia is a new woman, a character designed to embody relationships without ownership, and Rossi repurposes the name as a place name to tell recruits what kind of life is being proposed. It's not just branding, it fuses property, labor, and intimacy into one moral project, so that a farm becomes an argument about marriage and a bedroom becomes an argument about the state. That move also means the colony starts with a built-in advertisement: it sounds like a person, so it can be loved or hated like a person, even when it is really a parcel in Santa Barbara. When Cecilia Gattai writes a memoir in 1979 about her grandfather Francesco arriving as a colonist, she can attach her family story to a name that already carries a script. The background pressure that makes that script attractive is not unique to anarchists, it is the basic math of late 19th century migration. Italy in these decades produces emigrants at scale. Poverty, unemployment, rural crowding, and political policing adds an extra push for radicals whose meetings keep ending in arrests. Brazil, after abolition, needs labor and wants the interior populated, so it recruits Europeans through colonization projects that offer land on terms that look generous until you read the conditions. Inside the anarchist movement, the argument is strategic. Some, like Errico Malatesta, doubt the value of overseas communes and prefer agitation at home, while others treat a functioning commune as proof that a bossless society is possible now, not after a revolution. The passenger manifest for Francesco Gattai sits right at the intersection of those forces: a family leaving Italy for economic reasons, traveling under a political narrative, entering Brazil through a state program that has its own objectives. Rossi's rhetoric works in this moment because the era flatters anything that calls itself an experiment. Positivism is fashionable, science is treated as a civic replacement for religion, and progress is a word governments use the way engineers use efficiency. Rossi frames Cecilia as a social laboratory, remove formal authority, abolish property, loosen marriage, and observe whether solidarity emerges without coercion. Brazil's new republic is soaked in modernization talk of its own, and its institutions are built to measure and manage populations, not to debate metaphysics. The result is a strange compatibility. Rossi thinks he is running an ethical field trial, and the state thinks it is running a colonization program, and both can use the same nouns, land, labor, order, while meaning opposite things. That compatibility shows up as two narrators describing the same place in incompatible units. In Italian anarchist print culture, Lo Sperimentale, pamphlets like UN Commune Socialista, private letters, Cecilia is described as comrades trying to live freedom now, and the evidence is moral, behavior, relationships, voluntary work. In Brazilian paperwork it becomes a file, contract numbers, payment schedules, inspection requirements, and population counts that reduce ideology to demographics. A municipal register in Palmera in July 1891 records Colonia Cecilia as 156 souls, mostly Italian, with a gender imbalance of about 110 men to 46 women. Francesco Gattai's March Manifest entry doesn't mention philosophy either, but it plugs neatly into that register, as if a commune were just another way of organizing a census table. The site those papers refer to has a personality that refuses to stay abstract. Santa Barbara is a rural district inside Palmera, Paraná, about 14 kilometers from the town of Palmera and roughly 80 kilometers from Curitiba, close enough to be governed and far enough to make every trip a small expedition. The broader region is the Campos Gerais highlands, rolling fields broken by thick stands of Araucaria pine, with a subtropical climate, humid summers, cool winters, and winters cold enough for frost. Colonists describe the land as fertile enough for maize, not too stony, with abundant wood and water, which reads like a brochure until you picture the work implied by abundant wood. A commune can vote to abolish bosses, but it can't vote to abolish frost, and Paraná enforces its deadlines without paperwork. The physical work of turning that terrain into a settlement is the first mechanism that tests ideology. Forest has to be cleared for planting and for timber, fields have to be fenced and drained, and heavy rains can carve erosion into new clearings faster than a committee can schedule repairs. The colony's early founders include shoemakers, artisans, and political thinkers, which means agricultural competence has to be learned while living off the land's first yields. Every tool that breaks becomes a crisis because a broken axe is the difference between shelter and exposure, and this is why the March 1891 manifest line that calls Francesco Gattai a blacksmith is not a trivia detail. A blacksmith is a piece of infrastructure in human form, and the commune has to feed him while he makes the technology that makes feeding everyone else possible. Time becomes the first currency Cecilia can't abolish, because seasons don't care how egalitarian you are. Planting windows arrive on schedule, and frost is a deadline with no appeals, so deliberation competes directly with survival labor. The colony's ethic privileges voluntary work assignment and discussion over command, which means decisions cost hours, and hours in early Santa Barbara cost calories. The more people who arrive, the more time consensus consumes, and the less time remains for the synchronized labor the land requires, which is how ideology gets audited by weather. On paper, Francesco Gattai is a trade on a manifest. On the ground, he is another mouth, another set of hands, and another schedule that has to fit inside the same day. Infrastructure makes that audit visible in mud and distance. There is no railway line running through Santa Barbara in 1890, so transport is by road, cart, and foot, and roads have to be built before they can be relied on. Cecilia's land purchase contract requires a road, about 7 to 10 kilometers, later described as roughly 10 kilometers, connecting the parcel to the main route toward Palmera, because a settlement that can't be reached can't be supplied and can't be taxed. In the dry season it's a dusty track, in heavy rain it becomes a problem you solve with shovels, boards, and time, turning freedom into a question of whether the cart can move today. An anarchist commune begins, as many governments prefer, by doing public works. Palmera is the nearest interface where ideology meets the ordinary machinery of a province. The town is 14 kilometers away, close enough that colonists have to use it for supplies and paperwork, and far enough that every trip consumes daylight. It has a church that anchors social life, a marketplace where goods are priced in cash, and municipal offices that keep registers like the roll de habitants that turns a commune into 156 souls. A telegraph line exists in the wider region's modernization push, reminding everyone that the state's nervous system extends even into rural districts, even if the road to Cecilia is still mostly earth. When colonists walk into town to buy iron or register arrivals, the shopkeeper and the clerk don't need to judge their politics, they only need to decide whether they can pay. Even addresses become a kind of constraint, because Santa Barbara is already taken. The Polish Catholic settlement in the district is called Colonia Santa Barbara, and Ross's anarchists established themselves in the same district, so Santa Barbara can mean two incompatible moral universes depending on who is speaking. For officials in Palmyra, that isn't philosophy, it's a filing problem, a reason to specify Colonia Cecilia in a register so the souls are counted in the correct column. For immigrants writing back to Italy, it's a way to sound respectable. Your return address is a recognized colony name, even as the internal vow rejects the very authority that makes the address meaningful. A utopia that prides itself on rejecting labels still has to put something on the envelope. The neighboring settlements make the colony's moral experiment inseparable from local ecology. Santa Barbara already holds a Polish Catholic colony founded in the 1870s, Whitmarsum sits within the same immigrant landscape, and Brazilian caboclo farmers work nearby land in patterns that predate the European waves. Local accounts record that Polish neighbors initially give Cecilia a pig and a cow, a practical act of solidarity between immigrants who know what hunger looks like in a new place. The same accounts say goodwill flips into shunning once atheism and free love become known, because in rural Parana the church isn't only doctrine, it's the social network that decides whether you are us or those people. Help arrives as food and leaves as reputation, and neither transaction requires anyone to sign a contract. That social network is a surveillance system that doesn't require uniforms. Felich's archival work notes surveillance beginning as early as 1890 and intensifying later, but long before police attention becomes formal, the colony is already trapped in gossip geometry, a small town, tight immigrant communities, and a novelty that travels a story. A priest doesn't need to enter the communal hut to raise the price of your reputation, a sermon can do it, and rumor moves faster than an ox cart. The state doesn't need to argue with anarchism at the level of theory, it can enforce legibility through the simplest demands, payments, improvements, proof that the road exists and the land has been worked. In that environment, a promise of absolute freedom has to coexist with the fact that your neighbors can punish you without ever touching the law. The land itself is not morally neutral, and Cecilia's paperwork sits on top of older violence that the colony did not create but did inherit. The Campos Gerais region has historic indigenous presence, including Kaingang people, and by the time European colonies spread through Palmyra many had already been displaced by the same frontier politics that made land available. In Ross's correspondence with a friend named Sanftleben, he even toys, on paper, with the idea of trading liquor for young Indian women to address the colony's gender imbalance, a proposal that is both dehumanizing and revealing. There is no evidence that this was carried out, and it reads as desperation and entitlement rather than policy, but it shows how an anti-domination project can still speak the language of colonization when it needs a solution. A society can abolish the boss and still keep the frontier. The colony's founding moment, in the official record, is an agreement that looks allergic to romance. In 1890, land sale contract number 47 transfers 150 alqueires, about 363 hectares, through the colonization inspector to Giovanni Rossi on behalf of the group, for 3 conto de res paid in installments. The terms require the colonists to clear a specified amount of land, build the road, and pay an annual land tax, because the state is less interested in what you believe than in whether you improve and pay. The deed is in Ross's name, not because his ideology supports ownership but because bureaucracy needs a person to sue, bill, or evict. A commune that rejects private property begins with a private property document, which is either hypocrisy or the price of existing in a country that recognizes land only through paper. The contract's vocabulary is its own kind of domination, because it forces every dream into measurements. An alqueire is not a romantic unit, it is the state's way of turning forest into a number, and 150 alqueires becomes 363 hectares the moment someone needs to compare it to another parcel. A conto de res is the same, 3 contos sounds like a lump sum until you learn it is paid in installments, and an installment schedule is an engine that turns a commune into a pair on a calendar. The road clause converts belonging into infrastructure, and the clearing requirement converts ideology into the sound of axes, because the inspector can measure improvement even if he can't measure freedom. When a settlement that preaches voluntarism signs a contract that includes deadlines, the deadlines become the one part of the community everyone must treat as mandatory. That deed produces a quiet hierarchy even if no one calls it that. Rossi can insist that no one will be a boss, but the state has already installed him as the default interface, because installment schedules and tax obligations want a single name. The Republic's indifference turns into a kind of power. If payments lapse or required improvements aren't met, the land can be reclaimed, and there is no clause for, but we were running a moral experiment. For colonists who arrive later, the title is already a fact of life. Francesco Gattai's family steps off a ship in March 1891 into a settlement whose legal existence depends on Rossi's signature from the previous year. A movement can abolish masters in principle, but a contract can still appoint an administrator by accident. Descriptions of the first days on the land, when they are preserved, start with the bluntest verb, work. Rossi's 1891 writings describe the pioneers building a collective hut so everyone can sleep under one roof, and an eyewitness account attributed to Venturini says they arrive and immediately set to work, each swinging an axe or hoe, cheerful. By sunset there is a rough clearing and a temporary shelter, the first built environment in a project that will soon need multiple houses, a community hall, and a road. Later accounts disagree about whether the founders raised a red flag, a black flag, or a red and black one, which is a polite way of saying that even symbols get contested when the minutes aren't written down. The practical ceremony is simple: you can't argue about freedom while sleeping in the rain. Cecilia's internal constitution is not a notarized charter but a swarm of documents that travel outward. Instead of bylaws stamped by a lawyer, it has letters, pamphlets, and early reports that function as a constitution by publicity, because Rossi keeps writing and keeps publishing. Those texts make the colony answerable to an audience in Italy that will judge it as proof or embarrassment, which becomes a kind of enforcement even without police, shame and reputation as governance. This is also how recruitment works, because the same letter can be a confession to comrades and an advertisement to families looking for land, depending on who reads it. When Francesco Gattai's name appears in a manifest and later in a memoir tradition, it is partly because Rossi's paper machine made the destination famous enough to be recorded in multiple genres. The founders' vow, as described in their writing, is broad enough to swallow an entire society. They reject private property, refuse conventional hierarchy, and imagine labor organized by aptitude and willingness rather than command, in a settlement meant to be communal in goods and cooperative in work. Rossi's ideology also links intimacy to politics, marriage as ownership, jealousy as property logic, which is why free love sits in the same package as shared land and shared labor. It's a set of claims about human nature, stated in prose, without the kinds of enforcement clauses the Brazilian land contract contains. The contrast is literal: contract number 47 has penalties, while the moral vow has only the community's ability to stare at you until you comply or leave. Recruitment stretches the founding moment into 1891, and the documentary trail captures it as shipping schedules. Passenger manifests show multiple voyages aimed at Cecilia. On the 3rd of February, 1891, 6 families from Livorno arrive on the steamship Vittoria. On the 10th of March, 1891, the steamship Europa carries 13 families and 7 single men from Tuscany and Lombardy. That March list includes Francesco Gattai, Argia, and their children, which means the colony is no longer only a political cell, it is a place where kids will need food, shelter, and schooling long before ideology has answers. By April 1891, sources place nearly 150 people on site, and housing expands quickly, about 20 wooden huts and a community hall constructed to absorb the influx. In July 1891, Palmeiras municipal register counts 156 souls, which is the state's way of confirming that the recruitment worked whether or not the philosophy did. An open door changes the character of any experiment, and Cecilia commits to openness as part of its founding. Sources emphasize that the membership is not a uniform cadre of anarchist theorists. By design and by necessity it includes people drawn by land, escape, or curiosity, alongside true believers trying to live doctrine as daily habit. That diversity is a resource: more skills, more labor, more families like the Gattais who make a settlement feel real, and a built-in stressor, because shared property and non-traditional relationships assume a level of ideological buy-in that migration does not guarantee. The founding promise becomes an onboarding problem: how do you abolish hierarchy while teaching newcomers what the rules even are, especially when the rules are mostly unwritten? A commune without bosses still ends up needing orientation, and the first orientation tool it has is paperwork, the manifest that got you here and the contract that tells you what you owe once you arrive. All of this produces the founding paradox that never leaves the colony's physical space. Cecilia wants to interface with the state without becoming the state, but interface has a shape you can trip over: a deed in one name, installment payments, an annual land tax, inspectors who care about cleared hectares and passable roads, and a town 14 kilometers away that sells what you can't make. The imperial flirtation with Pedro II and the prestige of Carlos Gomez helped the dream launch, but the republic that replaces the emperor treats the settlement as a neutral administrative object with obligations attached. For a family like the Gattais, the utopia is not an abstract debate, it is a daily negotiation between the vow inside the communal hut and the deadlines inside contract number 47. The first thing the colony builds that everyone agrees exists is the road, and in the rainy season it turns to mud before it reaches Palmyra while the payment calendar keeps advancing. The notebook doesn't stay blank for long. Achille Dondelli keeps it open on whatever flat surface the settlement can spare, a plank on 2 stumps, a table inside the communal shed, and the first months of Colonia Cecilia show up as a procession of purchases that don't care what anyone believes. In July 1890 the communal fund is still fat enough to be written as a clean number, $5,000,000 race raised back in Italy. And then the same pages begin to fill with axes, hoes, seed, kerosene, nails, coffee, salt, the ordinary inventory of survival in Parana. Nobody gets a personal column, the cash is communal, the spending is communal, the handwriting is singular. On the wall nearby, one of the few public rules anyone will tolerate is short enough to be memorized and awkward enough to feel like a joke on purpose. No master, no slave here, work together, eat together. A commune that distrusts constitutions still ends up with a motto nailed to timber, because timber is where rules go when you refuse paper. Ross's own paper keeps arriving from his pen with the same stubborn reversal. In his letters and later in his 1893 brochure titled Cecilia, he argues that freedom can't be a prize you postpone until after some glorious historical struggle. It has to be practiced immediately in the smallest units of life, or the future version never materializes. The diagnosis underneath is blunt. Hierarchy is the infection, and it replicates everywhere, boss to worker, priest to parishioner, husband to wife, parent to child, until domination becomes a habit that feels like nature. That line isn't a metaphor in their mouths, it's a design spec, and Rossi borrows it from a century of anarchist shorthand that treats property and coercion as a coupled system, from Proudhon's slogan about theft to Bakunin's taste for burning down what can't be liberated. When later Brazilian summaries describe the colony's principles as negava a propriedade individual, denied individual property, they're not describing a budgeting preference. They're describing a theory that says you can't abolish masters while keeping the domestic versions of mastery intact, and that the family can function like a private state even when the big state is miles away. The physical layout tries to turn that thesis into muscle memory. Their first shelter is a collective wooden shed where multiple families sleep in the same rough volume of air, because privacy is treated as a bourgeois luxury and also because building materials don't multiply just because ideology is pure. Within a year the place has the rough shape of a small village, about 21-room wooden cabins built of pine, roofed in whatever can be managed, strung along a dirt path without a neat grid and without private lots. In the middle sits a larger pavilion that doubles as kitchen, dining hall, schoolroom, and meeting space. A single multipurpose room where the community eats and argues and teaches because separating functions would require resources and because separating functions would encourage mine and yours. There is no church building as a visible center, no mayor's house, no gatehouse, no fence line that politely tells a visitor where one household ends and the next begins. Contemporary descriptions linger on the same details: laundry hanging, chickens underfoot, children running between huts, as if the absence of property lines has to be rendered through domestic clutter. A map of Cecilia, if anyone had drafted one, would have needed a new symbol for shared on principle. Work begins as a kind of daily referendum that never reaches a final vote. By 5 a.m., people are awake, sometimes to a bell, sometimes to a bugle Rossi is said to have used to call gatherings, and the day's first ritual is communal coffee in the pavilion before anyone breaks into teams. The teams exist, but not as ranks. Carpenters and printers and former factory men rotate into field labor because specialization looks suspiciously like hierarchy, and because crops don't care whether you were born in Tuscany or trained at a press. When mid-morning comes and a teacher colonist is available, children sit for lessons. At times Rossi himself teaches basic literacy and math, switching between Italian and Portuguese because the settlement is an Italian dream inside a Brazilian administrative zone. Then a meal, then more work, then another meeting. The proposed solution is deliberately soft: persuasion instead of command, discussion instead of orders, the assumption that adults can coordinate without turning coordination into domination. The cost is immediate and measurable in hours. The more negotiable everything is, the more time you spend negotiating, and the day does not lengthen to honor the principle. A typical decision has the shape of a mundane crisis. A field needs clearing, a cabin needs roofing, a stretch of road needs cutting through brush because the land contract and the local state expect visible improvement, and nobody can solve it by simply assigning someone and walking away. They talk, not because talk is their hobby but because talk is their enforcement mechanism. You can't compel labor, so you have to make labor feel like a chosen act of mutual aid. Dondelli's ledger catches the material shadow of those conversations: seed and tools purchased out of the common fund, repairs made, small expenditures that only happen because a plan was agreed on. Later, in December 1891, Rossi will submit a report that reads like a checklist for bureaucrats and a manifesto for comrades at the same time: 80 alqueires planted in maize and beans, a collective shed, 20 cabins, barns, a cornflour mill, a fish tank, a nursery, wells, ditches, an orchard, stables. The report gets reprinted in an Italian geography periodical, La Geografia per Tutti, which means a leaderless commune ends up publishing its achievements in the format most loved by people who build empires: a list of assets. When things go wrong, the absence of punishment becomes a procedure. One account notes a fence failure that lets animals into crops, an error with real consequences in a subsistence economy, and the response is not a search for a culprit to discipline but a scramble for labor to repair. Neighbors help fix what breaks, partly because rural Parana runs on reciprocity and partly because the colony's survival requires relationships with people who do not share its politics. The moral claim says hierarchy produces cruelty, the practice tries to prove it by refusing cruelty even when someone's mistake costs food. Repairs become a kind of pedagogy: build it again, learn from it, don't turn technical failure into social degradation. There's an efficiency to hierarchy: punish one person, scare the rest. But Cecilia is trying to operate on a different fuel: the belief that dignity is not a bonus you earn after productivity but a condition for productivity itself. Written rules remain sparse by design, which makes every piece of writing heavier than it should be. The settlement doesn't draft a constitution in the style of a state because a dense rulebook looks like the first brick in a prison wall. Instead, there are fragments: a creed posted in the communal shed, a handful of agreed principles repeated aloud, the shared understanding that land and output are common even if personal clothing and a few private items remain attached to their owners. The ledger becomes a quiet center because it is where money goes to become reality, and money has a way of concentrating authority even when everyone hates the idea of authority. A person who tracks supplies is not automatically a ruler, but he becomes the one who knows exactly how many sacks are left and which merchant in Palmyra is willing to extend credit. If the utopia's aspiration is weightless freedom, the infrastructure of survival keeps giving certain hands more weight than others. By late 1891, scarcity forces a test that no one can solve with rhetoric. Provisions go missing, an internal theft that kicks off the kind of crisis a leaderless community is supposed to handle without creating a police force by accident. They convene, confront a suspect, and argue through the problem without formal charges, without a judge, without a punishment menu waiting in a drawer. The accounts that survive describe the outcome with a kind of strained tenderness: after debate that swings between anger and the recognition that they need every able body, they forgive the offender on a promise of reform. No expulsion, no jail, no handoff to the state. The enforcement is communal memory and communal eyes, the knowledge that in a village of huts you cannot steal invisibly, and that the heaviest sentence available is to be looked at differently at the shared table. That is the colony's legal system in miniature: shame and forgiveness in the same meeting, because empathy is easier than replacing a worker. The numbers in Dondelli's book keep moving in one direction regardless. The July 1890 balance is the kind of seed money that makes any project feel plausible. By August 1891 the ledger shows a collective purse nearly exhausted by tools, seed, food, and the constant consumption of a growing population. By early 1892, entries include purchases made on credit in nearby towns, flour, medicine, because the settlement is now living on reputation as much as on harvest. One of the pragmatic adaptations that anarchist doctrine doesn't advertise is wage labor. Some men go out to work on government projects and bring their earnings back into the communal pot, not as private wages but as temporary scaffolding for collective life. The logic is clean on paper: if it's voluntary and shared, it isn't exploitation, but in practice it means an anti-capitalist experiment is being kept alive by the same cash economy it claims is poisonous. The ledger ends up holding both the indictment and the dependency in adjacent lines. New arrivals arrive already formatted by the state's paperwork. Passenger manifests list waves of emigrants from Italy to Parana as if a utopia were just another migration destination. On the 3rd of February, 1891, 6 families sail from Livorno on the SS Vittoria. On the 10th of March, 1891, 13 families and 7 single men from Tuscany and Lombardy depart on the SS Europa. A name like Francesco Gattai appears with his wife, Argia, and 3 children, not as a romantic symbol but as a line item that means 5 more mouths at the communal table and 3 more bodies for the school corner of the pavilion. By July 1891 a Palmyra municipal register takes its own census of the experiment: Colonia, Cecilia, 156 souls, mostly Italian, and breaks the number down as roughly 110 men and 46 women, a demographic fact that will steer intimacy and labor more strongly than any manifesto. The archive counts them in the state's language, the colony counts itself in meals and work hours. Between those two counting systems, the children turn freedom into obligation on a schedule. The sexual politics are supposed to be as engineered as the labor politics. In principle, Colonia Cecilia rejects monogamous marriage and promotes a more lever, free love, not as a hedonistic perk but as a refusal to treat another person as property. Marriage, in this logic, is not romance but a contract of possession, a domestic hierarchy that teaches domination in the home and then exports it to work and government. In the colony's idealized version, women do not belong to men, relationships are supposed to be honest rather than exclusive, and jealousy is treated as a learned social disease rather than an eternal human law. No weddings are performed on site because binding contracts look like chains, and the community wants intimacy to remain voluntary association in the same sense that labor is voluntary association. Yet most of the people who arrive are not abstract subjects in an experiment. They include married couples like Akil and Katina Dondelli and families like the Gatais, and whatever the ideology says about marriage, those couples still wake up next to the same person in a one-room cabin they helped build. The policy abolishes the institution, the practice has to coexist with habit. The record of actual experimentation is narrower than the legend, which is part of why it gets remembered as scandal. Over 4 years, the sources point to 2 notable polyandric arrangements, one woman with 2 men, one of them involving Giovanni Rossi himself. Rossi later writes about a triad using names like Annabelle and Adele, framing the relationship as something to observe and learn from, as if jealousy were a chemical reaction that could be studied into submission. He coins language for the project, Batio Amorphista, the free-form kiss, terms that try to make a new sexual morality sound as ordinary as a new farming tool. Yet even in his own 1893 brochure, he reportedly avoids naming one of the men involved, a silence that functions like an index of the problem. The colony can abolish legal ownership, but it can't abolish the way reputations and wounds circulate in a small group. One colonist, referred to in later accounts as Jean G., is remembered as sliding into depression amid sexual frustration and emotional strain, a private collapse that becomes political because private pain in a commune has nowhere to hide. The demographic facts make the ideal harder to live than to proclaim. In the founding group, passenger records show 1 woman among 6 adults. By the July 1891 municipal register, there are still 110 men to 46 women, which means the free love policy sits on top of a scarcity that ideology cannot fix. A colonist complains in writing that free love has not entered the women's hearts, and that the resulting situation is creating trouble for single men, a sentence that reads like a moral complaint and a logistics report at once. Luigi Capellaro, writing to anarchist readers later in 1892, insists that nobody lacked respect toward women, a defensive line that matters because it implies the pressure was real enough to require public reassurance. Consent becomes an enforcement surface. The colony cannot compel desire without betraying its own thesis, so the system's only acceptable mechanism is to demand respect and to absorb frustration without converting it into coercion. In that sense, sexuality becomes governance terrain more directly than in almost any other utopia. The rules are supposed to be absent, which makes restraint the only proof of sincerity. Children make the whole argument heavier. The colony's ideal includes communal child-rearing and the abolition of paternal ownership. Children, in theory, would have no legally recognized fathers and no inheritance line, becoming children of the community rather than private assets of a household. Sanchez Neto, quoted in later summaries, describes the plan in that stark form, and the plan is not ornamental, it is the logical extension of a worldview that sees family hierarchy as the nursery of the state. In practice, the experiment is only partially tested because births on site appear to be few and poorly documented, and many children present in the settlement arrive with their parents rather than being born into the new system. What does exist is the daily infrastructure of collective care, the pavilion serving as schoolroom, the teaching done in Italian and Portuguese when someone is available, the absence of church rituals, the normalization of adults instructing any child because the idea of my child, my authority, is treated as a miniature monarchy. By early 1892, when Dondelli's ledger shows medicine purchased on credit, the theory about shared children meets the reality that someone has to find medicine, someone has to negotiate the debt, and someone has to decide which illness counts as urgent. The gender politics drag the old world back in through exhaustion, even when nobody votes for it. The colony's claim is explicit: women's emancipation is central, not auxiliary, and women do participate in discussions and, at times, in field labor, which is not a small shift in the early 1890s. But the municipal register's own arithmetic, 46 women among 156 souls in July 1891, also means domestic labor can become a scarcity problem. Cooking, cleaning, childcare, and nursing can't be wished away, and the people doing those tasks are the ones least able to take a day off without consequences cascading through the group. Because there are no formal bosses, the system relies on voluntarism and conscience, which can quietly translate into uneven burdens if some members feel more obligated than others. Nobody writes, "Women cook," into a rulebook. The pressure arrives as fatigue, as infants, as the simple fact that someone has to keep the shared hall functional while others clear land. In a leaderless system, the absence of compulsion doesn't eliminate hierarchy, it can shift it into the bodies of whoever cannot easily refuse. Outside eyes make private arrangements into public governance. The free love policy becomes the colony's most portable rumor, and even sympathetic accounts note that families inside the settlement resent being labeled promiscuous by outsiders who flatten a political theory into a tawdry headline. The community's response to defamation becomes a kind of unwritten rule: don't hand ammunition to the world you're trying to escape. In Curitiba, the Diario do Comércio runs a piece on the 22nd of December, 1892 defending the colony against specific rumors, including claims that the anarchists caused an uprising over unpaid wages. The paper insists those are lies and offers an outsider's snapshot of a community already shrinking in numbers. That defense matters not only because it corrects a story but because it shows how an authorityless community still has to manage its public file: what gets said, what gets denied, which allegations get answered. A commune can abolish internal courts and still find itself in the business of public relations, because the state and the press are both ways the outside world enforces legibility. Unwritten governance thickens as the settlement grows and strains. Without a formal constitution, behavior is guided by expectations that operate like law while claiming not to be law. Put the community first, don't hoard, don't undermine the cause, don't broadcast internal conflict to neighbors who already suspect you. In later recollections, Edgar Rodriguez frames departures as a sign that the colony didn't have the right people, a judgment that reveals the moral sorting mechanism at work. Those who stay are the committed, those who leave are the weak links. Labels substitute for statutes. Bourgeois, selfish, not committed, function as sanctions when there are no fines to levy, and the fear they generate is not fear of violence but fear of losing standing in the only society you have. The irony is that a system designed to abolish moral policing ends up using moral language as its primary tool of enforcement, because it has nothing else that doesn't resemble a state. Competence becomes a quiet ladder whether anyone admits it or not. Rossi is the public face and the ideological reference point, the one whose interpretation of anarchist principles carries weight when disputes arise over property, labor, or intimacy. Contemporary letters suggest he resists formal leadership. Later accounts note that by mid-1891 some colonists are calling him Professor Rossi, relying on him to negotiate with outside officials and to translate their anti-state experiment into something a local bureaucrat can understand without laughing. That deference is not written into a charter, but it is an observable structure. Certain voices settle arguments faster. When Rossi leaves for a period in 1891 to gather support and recruits in Italy, the settlement discovers what it has been pretending it doesn't have: a center of gravity. In his absence, Achille Dondelli is appointed by consensus as a kind of general manager, labeled gerente, a Portuguese title that lands with an administrative thud in the middle of an anarchist dream. The role is supposed to be facilitation, not command, but it is still a role that concentrates decisions about supplies, schedules, and crises. As the population surges and the infrastructure lags, that title starts behaving like a tool the ideology never wanted to manufacture. Accounts describe a mid-1891 shake-up, people leaving, the remainder reorganizing under stricter management, because feeding 156 souls with scarce harvests and unfinished buildings is not a task that stays poetic for long. Labor assignment becomes shadow politics: who suggests a job, who reliably volunteers, who becomes silently expected, who gets to avoid the ugliest work by claiming a special skill. The settlement still lacks jails, still lacks official punishments, still allows exit, but it now has a person whose handwriting controls the ledger and whose decisions affect whether credit continues in Palmyra. In a society that refuses coercion, supplies become their own kind of power, and a manager is simply the person who has to touch that power every day. The colony can insist it has no hierarchy. The grocery debt doesn't care what it's called. Ross's shadow extends beyond the settlement's day-to-day into the way the story gets told, even while it's happening. He writes continuously, letters, defenses, later memoir-like assessments, and those texts function as a constitution by narration for a community that declines to draft a constitution by law. A dated letter like the 17th of October, 1891 reads as both family correspondence and internal governance. He frames the project's troubles in terms of human weaknesses, jealousy, individual defects, more readily than he blames the core idea, which is a way of protecting the thesis by locating failure in the people. Later, in the 1893 brochure, he catalogues roads built and mills erected and then turns the same rhetorical move again. The experiment was sound, the material conditions and the participants weren't. That narrative isn't just post-mortem spin, it becomes an implicit rule for morale while the commune is still alive. Arithmetic sits in tension with it. Dondelli's ledger can record the same month without adjectives, money spent, credit taken, supplies dwindling, and those numbers do not accept moral reframing as payment. By the time Durante is in use, the colony's real constitution is already legible without anyone admitting it. It is written in fatigue, in the way certain criticisms are voiced softly to avoid being read as betrayal, in the way families who remain monogamous keep their heads down while outsiders shout promiscuity, in the way an accusation of selfishness can land harder than a legal charge because the punishment is isolation at a shared table. A leaderless system runs on trust, and trust can be withheld as cleanly as any tax. When Dondelli flips to the next page and adds another entry, August 1891, the communal fund thinning toward zero, another purchase on credit, there is no flourish, only the continuing requirement to turn ideals into food and tools and decisions. The paper that decides whether you get to keep sleeping on the same patch of ground in Santa Barbara isn't a manifesto. It's a land sale contract, number 47, dated March 1890, written for the Parana Colonization Authority, with Giovanni Rossi's name on it and a price that comes due in installments, 150 alquirs, about 363 hectares, for 3 conto de res, plus an annual land tax that doesn't care what anyone thinks about property. The clauses sit there with their own calm tempo, clear and plant, improve, prove you're using it, and, because this is how the state reads virtue in the countryside, cut a road. The road clause is the kind of sentence that turns an argument into sweat. 10 kilometers of road, hacked into a plateau roughly 900 meters high, not because the colonists decided roads were inherently liberatory, but because the contract is written for a world where occupation is a verb you have to perform on schedule. Every later speech about living without bosses gets held in place by that earlier signature, and every later arrival who came because they wanted to live without bosses steps into a legal arrangement where the colony's land is still, on paper, a private purchase with one buyer's name. A year later, the name Francesco Gattai appears in a different ledger, not a farm ledger but a passenger list, March 10, 1891, the ship Europa, the Archivio di Stato di Genova's lists of landings, families indexed like freight. He's listed with his wife, Argia, and 3 children. It's the kind of line that makes a utopia look like something that has to be tallied and stamped before it can even be imagined. In the story that survives through Cecilia Gattai's 1979 memoir, Granddaughter Looking Backward Through Family Law, this entry point matters because it's not an ideological baptism. It's an immigration system depositing people into a rural district named Palmera, with Santa Barbara as a locality and Curitiba about 80 kilometers away. The nearest rail station at Ponta Grossa roughly 50 kilometers off. A blacksmith arrives in a place where ironwork only matters if there is iron to work and fuel to heat it, and where even the most basic supply chain means turning 10 kilometers of contract-required road into an actual path that carts can travel when the rains come. The colony's promise is a community, the first enforceable reality is distance. By July 1891, the outside world has its own way of counting who belongs there, and it does it without asking whether anyone consented. A municipal register in Palmera records Colonia Cecilia as a population unit, 156 souls, with a breakdown that quietly announces the colony's internal imbalance to anyone who can read a table, far more men than women, children included in the arithmetic like an argument you can't ignore. Francesco's family is the type of family that turns a political experiment into a demographic fact, because children don't wait for the social theory to get its logistics right. The register doesn't list who believes what, it lists who is physically present in a place, on a date, under a jurisdiction. In a system that prides itself on refusing official categories, the first category that lands on them is the one the state uses for everyone, inhabitants. Inside the colony, the closest thing to an altar is a page where numbers are arranged so they can tell the truth without raising their voice. Achille Dondelli, who has the patience for accounting, keeps the financial ledger for 1890 to 1892, and the entries make the ideology do something it doesn't like doing, admit that money exists even when you refuse to worship it. In July 1890 the ledger notes $5,000,000 race, 5 contos, available, a cash position that sounds sturdy until you remember that it's being used to buy seeds, tools, nails, food, and whatever gets you through the gap between clearing land and harvesting anything edible. By August 1891, the same record shows near exhaustion. The word, credit, starts to appear as a method of survival. When the colony has to buy on credit, it is no longer negotiating only among itself. It is now negotiating with merchants and neighbors who do not share the colony's rules, who can enforce repayment by refusing to sell next week, and who have their own social penalties for people known as the anarchists in Santa Barbara. The common treasury is an idea, debt is a relationship with teeth. The infrastructure they manage to build becomes another kind of evidence, and they need it not only for themselves but for audiences who might still be persuaded. In December 1891 an agricultural output report is filed to the Parana authorities and later published in 1892 in La Geografia per tutti, in Italian, a document that reads like a resume for a commune. It lists 80 alquirs planted, a collective shed, about 20 small houses or cabins, barns, a corn mill, wells, ditches, an orchard, stables, a nursery, even a fish tank. Each item a physical improvement that can be checked off as proof that the land is being used, in the sense the contract cares about. The report's genre is compliance as optimism. It recites achievements in the language of productivity while leaving the softer questions: how many people are eating enough? How many meetings are being spent adjudicating exhaustion, outside the frame? For families like Francesco Gattai's, this kind of document becomes a backdrop to daily life. The colony can truthfully claim it dug wells, and the same colony can still be measuring meals in grams. Somewhere in the storehouse, a tool inventory from around 1892 lists what the experiment has in its hands, and the list has the practical bluntness of a packing slip: plows, spades, the implements of a community that is trying to become a farm. One detail lands like a gift and a complication at the same time: a steam-powered thresher donated by Italian syndicalists, recorded by Rossi in a June 1892 letter. It's a perfect collision of worlds: European political networks sending a machine across the Atlantic to an anarchist colony on a plateau, and then the machine arrives in a place where fuel, maintenance, and transport are not abstractions. If the thresher comes by rail, it still has to come the last 50 kilometers from Ponta Grossa over roads that have to exist before the machine can. A steam thresher is solidarity, but it is also weight. It's hard to abolish hierarchy when the heaviest object in your economy is a donation that requires someone to be responsible for keeping it running. The colony's public paper insists on a steady march of improvement, but private correspondence and press reports keep interrupting with the less photogenic math. In 1892, anarchist newspapers that are sympathetic to the project carry updates that don't sound like propaganda, they sound like triage. One report puts the daily ration at 50 grams of flour per person, a number so small it forces the imagination to picture the actual measurement: a hand scooping, a scale, a communal decision that becomes a child's portion. If you are Francesco Gattai arriving with 3 children, 50 grams per person is not a metaphor about scarcity, it is the rule that decides whether everyone eats that night, and it is enforced by whoever is serving food, not by police. The colony can be proud that no one is jailed for dissent inside Cecilia, and still have a food distribution system where hunger is the most persuasive speaker in the room. Outside the colony, other institutions keep their own records, and some of the most revealing ones are the records of absence. Parish registers in Palmyra show no marriages for the anarchists. The community's refusal to use church weddings is a policy choice that becomes a bureaucratic silence. The same registers contain a few baptisms, like the 1892 baptism of a baby in the Massa family, described in later scholarship as something driven by pressure from grandparents rather than sudden spiritual enthusiasm. The church is not a neutral service provider, it is a social infrastructure that assigns legitimacy, and Cecilia's refusal to participate gets interpreted as unusual irreligion, the kind of phrase that sounds like a diagnosis. If Francesco and Argia's children grow up without church rites, that is not only a family preference, it is a visible deviation in a rural Catholic region, the sort of deviation neighbors can punish with avoidance, gossip, or the slow withdrawal of the help that makes frontier life survivable. The neighbor's help is not imaginary, it shows up in specific incidents that become stories because they reveal a relationship in motion. When a fence collapses and animals spill, piglets and a cow in the wrong place at the wrong time, Polish neighbors are recorded as stepping in with generosity, donating a cow and piglets to cover losses, and Cecilia's people reciprocate by helping raise a barn. These are not ideological transactions, they are rural survival transactions, conducted in Santa Barbara by people who know that one bad week can cascade. Then the relationship shifts. By 1892, accounts say neighbors begin to avoid the anarchists, and Cecilia's residents have to travel farther to trade. The children become a boundary marker, unwelcome in play, not because they did anything actionable, but because they are a future that the surrounding community doesn't want normalized. For a family like the Gattais, the outside world isn't only the state, it's the nearest families who decide whether you can borrow a tool or share labor when the rains come. The press turns these local frictions into national narrative, and the story it chooses is rarely the one the colony is living. In June 1892, mainstream Brazilian papers like Gazeta de Notícias and Correio Paulistano cover the colony. In October 1891, L'Eco degli Emigranti, an Italian immigrant newspaper in Brazil, praises the road building and tries to defend the colonists against accusations of immorality. Then, on December 22, 1892, Diário do Comércio in Curitiba runs a piece addressing a rumor that the anarchists were behind worker unrest or a revolt linked to unpaid wages. A utopian farm gets treated as a labor agitation hub because the era's nervous system has a short circuit. Anarchist automatically means plot. The colony responds by inviting a journalist, transparency as self-defense, because the only way to fight a story is sometimes to provide a different story that can be printed. Somewhere between the flour ration and the newspaper column, Francesco Gattai is no longer just a man trying to feed children. He is a symbol being processed by editors who have never had to clear Brazilian forest by hand. The caricatures follow the newsprint logic. If the story is too complicated, draw it as a punchline. In January 1893, Revista Ilustrada publishes a cartoon titled A Utopia no Brasil, where the exiled Emperor Dom Pedro II, already displaced by the Republic, appears as a figure handing tools to anarchists, as if the regime change of 1889 still has the leisure to curate experiments. The drawing compresses years of legal reality, the imperial promise voided, the installment purchase, the tax, into a single absurd exchange, the old sovereign as benefactor of people who reject sovereignty. In February 1893, French papers seize on the colony's free love reputation, the scandal version of Cecilia that travels faster than an accurate inventory of plows. The collision is almost too neat. European readers get erotically charged utopia headlines at the same moment Cecilia is counting flour in grams and buying supplies on credit in the market towns of Parana. The state reads all of this differently, and it files it. In Rome, the Italian Foreign Ministry keeps a dossier under the label Polizia International, Busta 47, dated 1893, containing consular reports from Curitiba and intercepted letters, a bureaucratic genre in which human beings are reduced to elements and tendencies. The file notes that by February 1893 only about 50 people remain at Cecilia, a number that turns the colony's peak into a memory in one line. A report tied to the Parana governor recommends keeping the colony under watch in January 1893. It's the kind of recommendation that gets made when authorities are unsure what threat they are looking at but dislike uncertainty itself. Surveillance becomes another outside world tax, even if no one comes to arrest anyone. Being watched changes how people move through public space, how often they travel into town, how quickly rumor attaches to them. Francesco Gattai's name is already in the bureaucratic bloodstream through immigration records. Now the experiment he joined is in an international police folder whose number, 47, happens to echo the land contract number that started it. Paper likes patterns even when people don't. By late 1891 and into 1892, the colony's internal mechanics start to show what they cost when the weather, the soil, and the human capacity all tighten at once. The plateau's climate, cold nights, heavy rains, a growing season that punishes late sowing, does not adjust itself to accommodate a community learning agriculture by doing. Accounts mention ants destroying gardens, the first year's planting comes too late, floods and mud turn the 10 kilometers of road into a problem as much as a solution. When money runs out in August 1891, the colony's options are external wage labor, credit, or collapse, and each option changes the internal social contract. Men leave to work on government infrastructure projects, the wages become a lifeline, but the absence becomes a new scarcity, because the labor economy of Cecilia is also the bodies physically available to clear land, build cabins, and hold endless meetings. The project demands a high bandwidth of patience, negotiating work, negotiating love, negotiating conflict, and scarcity doesn't just reduce food, it reduces the time people can afford to spend being generous. The departures follow a pattern that looks, from a distance, like ideology failing, but up close resembles families doing arithmetic. Mid-June 1891 is recorded as a turning point. Too many people, too fast, not enough housing, not enough food, and the group designating someone, Don Deli, as gerente, a manager by necessity, because refusing authority does not keep crops from failing. By 1892, accounts say 7 pioneering families return to Italy, and others seek help through Italian mutual aid networks in Sao Paulo for repatriation passage, the kind of humiliating logistics that do not fit neatly into heroic narratives. For those who stay in Brazil, the reset is brutal. Former colonists become urban laborers in Curitiba or Sao Paulo with little capital, and at least one blacksmith from Cecilia, Giuseppe Massari, is recorded lamenting that he lost his tools to the communal venture and had to borrow to restart his trade. When the utopia is communal, the exit is individual, And no formal penalties does not mean no cost. It means the cost is simply delivered by the world. Giovanni Rossi's private letter to his family on October 17, 1891, written from Italy after leaving Brazil mid-crisis, shows how even the founder uses paperwork to manage blame. He writes that the crisis must be blamed on the people, not the idea itself, a sentence that tries to quarantine the anarchist ideal from the messy reality of tired humans in Piranha. It is a move as old as utopian literature, protect the concept by relocating failure into character. The letter is also an artifact of distance. From Italy, the colony becomes an object you can describe. From Santa Barbara, it is the day-to-day system of who works, who eats, who is leaving, who is returning, who is silent. For Francesco Gattai, Rossi's letter is not a comfort because it isn't addressed to him, it's the founder's private accounting, while the colony's ledger is turning into a list of things bought on credit and promises made to people outside the commune's circle. The narrative that Rossi publishes in 1893, in Livorno, Cecilia, Comunità Anarchica Sperimentale, moves in the opposite direction, toward controlled storytelling. He can list achievements with pride, more than 10 kilometers of road built, the collective shed, the individual cabins, the mill, the fish tank, the nursery. The same period produces a different kind of document circulation. His final balance sheets get reprinted in anarchist papers across the diaspora, Chicago's Illinois Guido, Buenos Aires's El Perseguido, where numbers and narrative travel faster than the people who live them. This is how utopias become portable, they get condensed into text that can survive the failure of crops. The outside world that mocked Cecilia as scandal can now consume Cecilia as a moral lesson, and both versions of consumption happen while actual families are choosing whether to walk away in the dark to avoid being stopped. By early 1893, with the population shrinking toward the 50 noted in the police file, the colony's structure begins to fail in the specific way its design makes likely. Every person who leaves removes not only labor but also a piece of the social web that made consensus possible. The meetings that once felt like freedom now compete with the simplest emergency: plant, harvest, repair, fetch water. Scarcity weaponizes conflict because every disagreement becomes tied to survival. Relationship experimentation, already a daily negotiation when resources were adequate, turns harsher when food is short, because the cost of emotional labor rises precisely as the available energy drops. In the absence of formal enforcement mechanisms, the colony can't impose a solution the way a state can. It can only persuade, shame, plead, or watch people go. The design refuses coercion, and then reality supplies its own coercion in the form of hunger, debt, and the social pressure of neighbors who have decided not to trade with you anymore. Ross's own exit from the colony in May 1893, the move to Curitiba and the attempt to run a distillery that fails, turns the founder into another departing figure, and the departure changes what the experiment even is. When the ideological magnet leaves, what remains are people who still have to live on the land, in Santa Barbara, under the same tax regime and the same weather. Contemporary and near-contemporary reports suggest that the last few residents begin farming individually, partitioning the communal experiment into conventional households not because they have been converted by capitalism, but because the collective model has lost too many participants to function. The legal end is quiet enough that later historians have to infer a dissolution notice in 1894 from local cartorio histories, an entry in a registry book that may or may not survive in full, marking the cessation of Colonia Socialista Cecilia as an organized entity. The Republic does not need to raid the commune. It can simply wait for installment payments and taxes, and for the communal will to drain away. The most intimate evidence of collapse isn't in a police dossier or a newspaper column, it's in an exit that looks like it's trying not to be noticed. In Cecilia Gattai's telling, her grandparents, Francesco and Argia, leave Cecilia at dawn, quietly, with their children, and they leave a note behind asking not to be searched for. The act is simple and procedural: pack what you can carry, choose a time when no one is awake to argue, write a message so the people who remain are not forced to mount a search party, and step onto the road. That road exists because of contract number 47, because the colonization authority wanted proof of improvement, because a utopian community had to translate its existence into infrastructure a state could recognize. The note is not a manifesto. It does not debate whether anarchism is true. It is the bare minimum communication required to exit a social system without turning the exit into another assembly. After they leave, the evidence fragments into the kinds of traces that survive family life. The memoir published in Sao Paulo in 1979 preserves the story because it was told enough times to be remembered, and also because it was not told in full. The same memoir notes that Francesco rarely spoke about Cecilia afterward. That silence becomes part of the archive, too, because it hints at a stigma attached to the experiment in a Brazil where anarchist could mean immoral, dangerous, or simply strange. In 1900, a census lists Italian family heads like Dondelli, Agostini, and Mezzadri still on the land, recorded not as utopians but as ordinary colonos, a bureaucratic end state where the state's categories have reasserted themselves. In 1976, a French film titled La Cecilia turns the story into cinema. In 1949, a Brazilian novel by Afonso Schmidt turns it into literature. In 2011, a newspaper in Parana reproduces one of the few surviving photographs of the settlers, posed with tools and children in front of wooden houses. The image held in the Museo Histórico de Palmera as proof that the bodies were real even if the ideas became myth. At Santa Barbara today there is a memorial site, open air, modest, the sort of monument that can exist without pretending it solved anything, because the road and the story both outlasted the collective. The state that once counted Cecilia's residents in a register and watched them in a file never had to decide whether their ideals were valid, it only had to decide whether they were compliant. The anarchists, for their part, managed to build what they said they would build, a community without formal bosses, without formal police, without church weddings, anchored in mutual aid and the daily labor of corn and beans. And they paid for it with the one currency they could never replenish on schedule, human energy. When Francesco Gatti's Dawn notes it's alongside Ross's October letter in the Archive of Memory, the experiment looks less like a parable about purity and more like a ledger with two columns that never reconciled. Freedom on one side, subsistence on the other, written in ink that had to dry before anyone could decide what it meant.